You know how George Washington had wooden teeth? Yeah, he didn't. His dentures were made of ivory, gold, and even teeth from other people, but never wood. That's just one of the facts you probably learned in school that's totally wrong. We're also going to talk about why Napoleon wasn't short and how Christopher Columbus absolutely did not prove the Earth was round. These are the real stories your history teacher got wrong, and trust me, they're way better than the myths. Let's get into it. We all have these little historical facts stuck in our heads, right? Things we picked up in class that just feel true. We see them in movies, we hear them in conversation, and they just become history. But what if I told you that some of the biggest stories you were taught are, to put it gently, complete nonsense? History is so much weirder and more complicated than the highlight reel we get in school. It's not just a timeline of dates and battles. It's a tangled mess of propaganda, simple mistakes, and straight-up lies that got passed down through the years. So today, we're taking a sledgehammer to a few of those historical truths to find out what's really going on. Get ready to question pretty much everything. Section 1. The Napoleon Complex is a lie. First up, let's talk about a big historical figure, or a supposedly small one. Napoleon Bonaparte. The name alone makes you picture a tiny, angry dude trying to conquer the world to make up for his height. We even named a psychological complex after it. It's a perfect story, right? The short-tempered general overcompensating with pure military genius. But here's the thing. Napoleon wasn't even short. When he died, he was measured at 5 feet 2 inches in French units. And that's the key. The French inch, the pouce, was longer than the British inch. Once you do the conversion, Napoleon was about 5'6". That was a totally normal, maybe even slightly above average height for a guy in France back then. So where did the little Boney myth come from? 2 places, propaganda and his own army. The main source was British political cartoons. At the peak of the Napoleonic Wars, British cartoonists, especially the famous James Gillray, had a field day drawing their arch-enemy as a comically small, tantrum-throwing child. Napoleon himself admitted Gillray did more than all the armies of Europe to bring me down. The image was powerful, humiliating, and it stuck. The other part of the illusion was his own imperial guard. Napoleon liked to surround himself with these elite soldiers who were all chosen specifically because they were tall and intimidating. So, if you're a guy of average height who's always standing next to giants, you're going to look short by comparison. His own soldiers also gave him the nickname Le Petit Caporal, the little corporal. But this wasn't a dig at his height, it was a term of endearment he earned by being in the trenches with his men. For his enemies, though, it was just more ammo. The myth of a tiny, furious Napoleon was just way better propaganda than the truth of an average-sized, brilliant military commander. Section 2. Marie Antoinette never said, "Let them eat cake." Of all the cold-hearted quotes in history, this one is probably the most famous. The scene, revolutionary France. The people are starving because there's no bread. When the Queen, Marie Antoinette, hears about it, she supposedly scoffs and says the iconic line, "Let them eat cake." It's the ultimate symbol of a ruler so disconnected from her people that she can't even grasp their suffering. It's a great story. It's also a total lie. There is zero evidence Marie Antoinette ever said this. In fact, a version of that phrase was already floating around decades before she was a public figure. The philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau wrote about a great princess who said, qu'ils mangent de la brioche, let them eat brioche, in his book Confessions. He wrote that part around 1767, when Marie Antoinette was just a kid in Austria, years before she ever set foot in the French court. Rousseau never even named the princess. It might have been a subtle jab at Maria Therese, the wife of Louis XIV, who lived a century earlier. So how did it get pinned on Marie Antoinette? Because she was the perfect scapegoat. By the time the French Revolution kicked off, people already hated her. They saw her as a foreigner who spent too much money and was completely out of touch. Anti-royalist writers used every trick in the book to make her look bad. And pinning this heartless quote on her was a stroke of genius. It was the perfect soundbite for everything the revolutionaries said was wrong with the monarchy. It didn't matter that her own letters show someone who was actually concerned about the poor. The lie was just more powerful. The story didn't really get stuck to her until the 1800s, long after she was executed, when writers cemented the myth into history. She was basically the victim of one of history's most successful smear campaigns. Okay, quick break. If you're enjoying having your entire grade school education dismantled, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. We're tearing down historical myths like this all the time, and you don't want to be the one left believing in wooden teeth. Now, back to the lies. Section 3. Columbus did not prove the Earth was round. This one is a classic in American history class. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue to prove to a bunch of flat earthers that the world was round. He was a brave visionary, fighting against the ignorance of his time. It's a great story of courage, and it's almost completely made up. Here's the truth. By 1492, every educated person knew the Earth was a sphere. Seriously. That knowledge had been common for almost 2,000 years. The ancient Greeks figured it out as early as the 6th century BC. Thinkers like Pythagoras and Aristotle proved it by observing the Earth's curved shadow on the moon during an eclipse and watching ships disappear over the horizon. By Columbus's time, any scholar or navigator worth their salt accepted that the Earth was round. So, if he wasn't trying to prove the Earth's shape, what was the big deal with his voyage? It wasn't about the shape of the planet, it was about its size. Columbus thought the Earth was way, way smaller than it actually is. He completely underestimated its circumference and thought Asia was much bigger than it was. By his math, Japan was only about 3,000 miles west of Europe. The experts in the Spanish court knew he was wrong. Their calculations were far more accurate and showed the distance was more like 10,000 miles, a journey no ship back then could survive. They didn't turn him down because they thought he'd fall off the edge of the world. They turned him down because they thought he and his crew would starve to death in the middle of nowhere. And they would have been right if a continent he knew nothing about hadn't gotten in the way. The myth of Columbus, the flat earth debunker, was mostly invented in the 19th century by the American writer Washington Irving, who wanted to paint Columbus as a romantic hero for a young country. Section 4. Witches weren't burned at the stake in Salem. When you think of the Salem Witch Trials, you probably picture mass hysteria, angry mobs, and women being burned at the stake. It's a terrifying image we've seen in movies and pop culture a million times. But during the actual Salem Witch Trials in 1692, not a single person was executed by burning. The real method of execution for the 19 people convicted of witchcraft in colonial Massachusetts was hanging. 14 women and 5 men were sent to the gallows. We get the whole burning at the stake idea because we mix it up with the European witch hunts, which happened on a much larger scale and where burning was a common punishment. But in the English colonies, the law treated witchcraft as a felony, and the penalty was hanging. Now, while no one was burned, the reality was still absolutely horrifying. On top of the 19 who were hanged, at least 5 others died in the filthy, disease-ridden jails. And then there's the uniquely awful case of Giles Corey, an elderly farmer. He refused to plead guilty or not guilty, which was a legal move to keep the government from seizing his land from his family. As punishment, the court used a medieval torture called peine forte et dure, or pressing. They piled heavy stones on his chest for 2 days until he died. His reported last words were a defiant, "More weight." The story of Salem is a dark chapter of paranoia and injustice, but the image we have in our heads is distorted. The truth of the gallows and the crushing of Giles Corey is plenty grim without any imagined flames. Section 5. The Great Chicago Fire and the Innocent Cow. It's one of history's most specific and weirdly charming disaster stories. On October 8, 1871, a cow owned by a Mrs. Catherine O'Leary kicked over a lantern in her barn, and that little accident started the Great Chicago Fire. The fire destroyed 3 square miles of the city, killed about 300 people, and left 100,000 homeless, all because of one clumsy cow. It's a simple story to remember. It's also a lie, cooked up from sensational journalism and ugly anti-immigrant prejudice. Mrs. O'Leary was a poor Irish Catholic immigrant, making her the perfect scapegoat for a city desperate to blame someone. The cow story started appearing in newspapers right away, with one writer even making up a story that she started the fire on purpose. Catherine O'Leary denied it for the rest of her life, swearing she was in bed asleep when the fire broke out. An official investigation later cleared Mrs. O'Leary of all responsibility, concluding only that the fire started near her barn. The actual cause was never determined. So where did the cow story come from? Years later, a reporter named Michael Ahern admitted he and his colleagues just made it up because they thought it made for a better story. That lie stuck so hard that it ruined Catherine O'Leary's life and became a permanent part of Chicago's identity. It wasn't until 1997 that the Chicago City Council passed a resolution that officially cleared Mrs. O'Leary and her cow. The real cause of the fire is still a mystery, but one thing is for sure: the cow is innocent. Conclusion. Napoleon was average height, Marie Antoinette was framed, Columbus was just bad at math, Salem's horrors were different from what we picture, and a poor cow got a century of bad press. These stories we've told for generations, the ones that feel like historical bedrock, are often just built on propaganda, rumors, or a story that was too good to fact-check. History is never as simple as we learned it in school. It's a messy, complicated, and deeply human thing. And the real stories, with all their twists and turns, are almost always more fascinating than the myths. And learning this stuff isn't just for winning a trivia night. It gives us a better, more honest way to understand the past and see how these stories were used to shape our world today. What other history facts have you always been a little suspicious of? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching.